Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. Nick Fuentes, for those of you who don't know, is a former YouTuber and current podcaster and commentator. He is an American nationalist and paleoconservative who hosts the podcast America First with Nick Fuentes, which airs on DLive and Spotify. He was banned from YouTube in February 2020 for unspecified reasons that I'm certain he and I would agree are completely idiotic. From my cursory examination, something hate speech. The extent of his content on YouTube comes from fan clips of his show. But to be honest, I'm not familiar with his content. To me, he was some other content creator other anarchists would mention every now and then, but I've been recommended to reply to him, so I thought it would be an interesting case study. Allegedly, he is an absolutist, a third positionist, white nationalist, ethno-nationalist, national socialist, unironic fascist, whatever labels used to describe authoritarians nostalgic for compulsion. But first, we need to establish that he's an authoritarian first. So let's do a quick test. Does he seek to use the violence of the state to victimize peaceful people?
We're putting all libertarians in jail in 2019. Unapologetically statist. We are using the monopoly of force that is the government. We're using violence to end libertarianism.
Well, you don't get more clear-cut than that. This remark is the rhetorical equivalent of punching your opponent in grade school debate club. Mr. Fuentes must know he cannot win against libertarianism either because he knows libertarians are correct or he is insecure about his ability to articulate against libertarianism. Hence, the need to dominate his opponents using government force. Either way, he concedes the debate. Good ideas don't require force. 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4 just because the biggest, strongest guy on Earth says so. At this point, I can end the video, but we're not here for a response to the most basic surface-level arguments. So, what's his justification for everything?
Libertarian, that's the bio, always. I'm nerdy, libertarian, and frequently sarcastic. These people should be put in jail. But I saw these people and I thought, these are the people that are a threat to the welfare of the people. These are the people standing in the way of the will of the nation being executed.
At least I'm not taking it out of context. The only explanation I can think of as to why libertarians ought to be kidnapped and imprisoned that doesn't appeal to logical fallacies or circular reasoning is that holding libertarian beliefs victimizes someone. The closest victim here is this will of the nation. Trouble is, well, what is that? It's an abstraction. Since a nation is also an abstraction, it's an abstraction that somehow abstractions can think, act, or speak autonomously. However, the actions and will of a nation is never subject to observation, experimentation, or the scientific method of any sort. It's an unprovable hypothesis that has left the realm of the scientific. It's a proposition based entirely on faith. An accusation I don't think Mr. Fuentes would contest. Here, we're getting into the core of his belief system. Absolutism is a reaction to the perception of the prevalence of hedonism in society caused by an absence of conformity to social norms. It is argued that tightening the limits of acceptable social behavior while creating mythologies around the attributes and actions perceived to be virtuous would curtail hedonism and result in people living more orderly, disciplined, and happy lives. Right now, I want to talk about the use of mythologies. Now, I get it. Storytelling is a time-tested way of explaining and passing on complex ideas, virtues, ethics, morals, and philosophies for thousands of years. Jesus Christ passed on his teaching to his disciples through metaphors, because if they figure out what the heck the mustard seed is supposed to represent for themselves, the message sticks in their heads a lot more easily than if he just came out and said what he meant. For good or for ill, we're still doing this. Movies and TV shows often feature a message, theme, or commentary on real life. Star Wars: A New Hope was about the triumph of nature over technology, and District 13 was a commentary on South American apartheid, just listing 2 examples. Media with messages beyond their plots will continue well past our lifetimes. The trouble is what messages are being taught under absolutist mythology. Conform your behavior to the will of the nation? We still haven't answered the question as to what that is, beyond some nebulous abstraction of an abstraction. Well, that's a lie. We know what the will of the nation is. It's a fiction, designed to manipulate the ignorant into conflating society with the state. Its will is special knowledge, exclusive to those who claim to be able to interpret it and whose interpretation of the will, let alone access to the will, is not subject to the scientific method. As such, those nation speakers will have a monopoly on what is the will of the nation. Given that one must conform their behavior to this will, the nation speaker will have the exclusive power to define what that will is. It gives tremendous power to this new priestly class that must come about. They will have virtually unlimited power to interpret this will, and will do so to their own personal benefit, or to the benefit of the ruling class. I mean, why wouldn't they? How could anyone else know they're wrong? We know from the stories of King Solomon and King David that those given earthly power come to abuse it. And why should this surprise anyone, given Satan's claim to Jesus in Luke 4, 5-7, that earthly authority is his, to give to whom he sees fit? Now, Satan is the Lord of lies, but given that this claim is not contradicted by Jesus, and consistent with what we observe both in the Bible and the corruption and criminality rampant throughout the world governments today and historical, well, the lie that Satan is peddling must be elsewhere. Plato's Republic justified its totalitarian hellscape on the exclusive access gold-cast philosopher kings had to the mystical world of forms that was in no way verifiable or the knowledge allegedly therein transferable, from which they would claim to know objective truth. It's all lies, designed to preserve the monopoly the ruling priesthood of statism holds on right and wrong. Rational people would realize pretty quickly that people with claim to special knowledge that was immune to the scientific method are liars and charlatans, which I think is the other useful service myths provide for the authoritarian. Indoctrinating people to view the world entirely around myths and allegories as opposed to cause and effect is a great way to short-circuit logical reasoning, making entire populations ripe for exploitation and appropriation. Fiction can be useful as a medium of entertainment and for teaching truths. Good stories can do both. Using stories to teach people falsehoods is just manipulation. Now, Mr. Fuentes frequently justifies this manipulation by professing his preferences of morally acceptable behavior in the name of Christianity. He claims to be Catholic, which is why I made my appeals to the Bible, but his demand for state-enforced morality echoes the pietists of late 19th and early 20th century America who sought to use the state to enforce their preferences for social norms as well as restrict immigration, something Mr. Fuentes also strongly advocates for. The pietists consisted of Scandinavian Lutherans and Protestants of British descent. Their opponents, the more libertine liturgicals, were the Catholics. In other words, his arguments for using the earthly powers of Satan in the name of Christ is not only extremely Protestant, but also quite blasphemous. As a fellow Catholic, I wonder if he truly worships God or if he worships the state. There is no king but Christ. Mr. Fuentes outright advocates for idolatry in making myths out of politicians or government agents, idolizing them for what they represent rather than who they are or what they have done. Mr. Fuentes mentions supporting Donald Trump for what he represents rather than what he's actually done in the aforementioned Trudeau-Tom discussion. I can see why he'd want to, otherwise he'd have to admit what Trump has done, which has been nothing short of unholy. But what does Trump represent? I don't know. Depends on who you ask, I think. SJWs would claim he represents patriarchy and capitalism triumphant. To Mr. Fuentes, I imagine Trump is an assertion by white America that they detest the direction of the country and its takeover by hedonists and want to reverse course. To me, Trump is one of the last gasps of a dying institution fading into irrelevance due to circumstances well beyond my or Mr. Fuentes' control. Suffice to say, he means different things to different people. But for any myth to have Mr. Fuentes' desired effect, the narrative must be centralized, which, once again, gives tremendous power to those entrusted with this power who must pinky promise not to abuse their monopoly on deciding what X thing or person Y represents, even if it's a blatant falsehood. It's just propaganda. No different than when the Soviet Union demands people not eat more than their fair share, which, if this propaganda poster is to be believed, consists of a single fish. But maybe that's all fine. Maybe Mr. Fuentes' rejection of modernity extends to epistemology, that is, how we understand truth. To Mr. Fuentes, perhaps, the truth has no relationship with facts, reason, or logic. Perhaps any cultural myth at all is better than hyper-rationalist modernity, no matter how corrupt or corruptible its purveyors, or how degenerate the beliefs or actions ennobled within myth without even the pretense of reprisal on the part of their subjects, even if the myth-tellers themselves use their monopoly to overtly preach degeneracy. I could be wrong in my interpretation of Mr. Fuentes' beliefs, but it seems to me that for all he cares, the priesthood of statism could be literal Slanesh worshippers, and he'd prefer that. Now, if you agree with my premise that the arbitrary nature of a proposed axiom or law disqualifies it from being truth, then I shouldn't need to explain any further. If not, well, it'll all make sense soon, I promise. Right now, there's 3 more points I want to address, about individualism, voting, and tradition. Now, Mr. Fuentes argues that the individual doesn't exist. It's one of his criticisms of libertarianism. Not in the context of him wanting to jail us, but it's there. Now, I know for a fact, I'm pretty sure he doesn't mean individuals don't exist. He's not a solipsist or a nihilist, thank God. But strictly speaking, yes, there is no such thing as a category called individual. Those who fall into that category do exist, but it's an a priori concept, used to understand constituent, singular members of groups. Individual humans, basically. However, by the same standard, groups also do not exist. There is no such thing as a race, ethnicity, or family, despite its importance in Mr. Fuentes' methodology. He believes the most basic social unit in society is the family. However, unlike the individual, there's no clear or consistent definition for what a family is. Does it refer to a 2-parent household consisting of hatchlings? What about a boyfriend or girlfriend relationship? Are single parents part of a family? What about families not by blood, such as adopted siblings, or people just with extremely close bonds? I reckon SEAL team, fire teams are like family to each other. Most family friends will often be known as uncle or aunt by the kids. So what's a family? What happens to those who fall out of the arbitrarily defined category of family? Are they simply unpersoned? More importantly, can you prove that these arbitrarily defined groups have rights that supersede the rights of individuals? We know that individuals have rights because we own ourselves. Our agency makes us responsible for our actions, our labor, our thoughts, and our words. It's how I can hold Mr. Fuentes responsible for the words he says and not his hypothetical anonymous puppet master. We are fully capable of thinking and acting independently of the little boxes Mr. Fuentes wants to put us in. He himself has demonstrated this when he went against the wishes of his own family in his eulogy to John McCain, so this shouldn't be controversial. Nevertheless, his skepticism towards the concept of individualism really stems from a dislike of modernity rather than any principled argument against it. Often, he conflates libertarianism with constitutionalism while making a presuppositional argument against freedom on the basis of people engaging in certain behaviors he personally finds distasteful, attempting to argue not only that his preferences are an objective principle, but that he knows that the people he seeks to use as examples are as shallow and their lives as uneventful as he makes them out to be. To him, this is also evidence that people cannot be trusted to make choices for themselves. Not some people, people. As in literally everyone that has ever lived. And not that they can't govern themselves, they can't make choices for themselves. Mr. Fuentes asserts this in favor of hierarchical governments. People can't choose for themselves, therefore we need hierarchical governments. I imagine most of my regular viewers see the problem already. How is it that people who, as a whole, cannot make choices for themselves, let alone govern themselves, can be trusted to make choices for and govern others? Jesus questioned the right of the Pharisees to demand righteousness from others when they themselves aren't righteous. So too do I see the hypocrisy of governance by men who, according to Mr. Fuentes, cannot be trusted to govern themselves, let alone choose for themselves. Mr. Fuentes may or may not believe that demanding of others what oneself will not is perfectly fine and dandy, but if so, he'll need to take another look at Christ's teachings if he wants to continue calling himself a Catholic. Wait a minute. These are the same people who can't be trusted to choose for themselves, but can be trusted to interpret the will of the nation, who can be trusted to decide what is good and noble and virtuous, as well as what is evil and nasty and wrong, who can be trusted to create myths idolizing their arbitrarily defined virtues. You see the problem here yet? You cannot get around this by creating a group of people who can choose for themselves, because we end up with a recursion problem. Who decides they can choose for themselves? Other people who can't choose for themselves? If they can, then who decided that? Other people who can't choose for themselves ad infinitum. Appealing to divine revelation, such as the divine right of kings, doesn't work either. How can you prove if I'm lying, for example, if I claim that God has blessed me with special knowledge to choose for myself and others? You can't. But I can at least see where Mr. Fuentes is coming from. Let's call this the dumb voter problem. The basic idea is that legislative proposals that would greatly benefit everyone, or politicians that would support it, are stopped because of dumb voters, due to ignorance or just blind self-interest. In this metaphor, the proposal is liberty, as Mr. Fuentes claims to have once been a libertarian. But he came to perceive the dumb voters themselves as the problem, rather than the absence of its legislative agenda. What they were voting for was more calamitous than what they were voting against, you see. The logic goes that if one has a more restrained Christian sense of morality in society, contrary to the interests of transsexuals, gays, basketball Americans, Jews, and others, their ability to veto the correct agenda and institutionalize their own through the electoral process is a threat, especially in a democracy where who has property rights and for what purposes other people's stolen money is spent is always up for a vote. There's just one little problem. Your vote doesn't matter! That's not an inference. We have empirical evidence that a legislative agenda is equally as likely to be passed if it has 0% popular support or 100. Sure, politicians may give lofty promises, and the rhetoric of the enemy party candidates may seem scary, but we know for a fact that the politicians don't care what we think, short-circuiting the narrative that elected politicians are beholden to their voters. If they were, well, this graph wouldn't look like this. The US government is financially beholden to central banksters and subject to the whims of foreign governments like Israel and Saudi Arabia. This isn't controversial to Mr. Fuentes. Despite being fully aware of this, he doesn't realize our divine overlord's handlers would not wish someone who could actually threaten their interests to take power. Why wouldn't they take measures to assure that doesn't happen? Ensure that any truly revolutionary candidates never even enter on the primary ballot. Use their power and influence to squelch them into obscurity, such that all the candidates that are left are those that are willing to play the game. Yes, this includes Donald Trump. He's continued the perpetual wars and tax and spend agendas of Barack Obama without even the pretense of returning the US to sound money or rolling back the influence of foreign governments and banksters. Where's the wall, huh? It took the threat of a fake pandemic, which pharmaceutical cartels plan to profit off of immensely, for him to shut down immigration by imperial decree. So riddle me this, Batman. How is he not more of the same? Now, that said, Mr. Fuentes has been critical of democracy, as well as he should, but his intellectual framework rests on the erroneous assumption that voting matters. Things happen in democracies because they serve the state's interests. Once one recognizes this and takes that to its logical conclusion, they'll realize two things. 1. The state does not and will never care about you. 2. Whether or not we have a free society will never be up for a vote. All voting does is manipulate the gullible into associating their material interests and the fulfillment thereof with the state. As Mark Twain said, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it. Though considering Mr. Fuentes seeks to create a disciplined and joyless culture, I'm surprised he would go against what the Founding Fathers intended when they decided to make the US government partially democratic. As Thaddeus Russell put it in A Renegade History of the United States, to solve the lack of order they saw all around them, the Founding Fathers seized on one of the great and often missed ironies in world history. The only thing that could make men forsake their own freedom and still believe they were free was self-rule. A government of the people, John Adams argued, would make the people disciplined, stern, hard-working, and joyless, the qualities he most admired. A monarchy, on the other hand, would let them have too much fun and, paradoxically, allow them too much liberty. Kind of flips things on its head, doesn't it? Modernism at the time was not an abolition of restraints, but a demand for increased restraint. To them, the absolutists were the degenerates. Colonial America, particularly in population centers such as Boston, were full of taverns, brothels, interracial relationships, homosexuality, and even cross-dressing being practiced openly in city streets. A wretched hive of scum and villainy, I suppose. The idea behind what is now known as the modernist movement was that the corporal punishment of monarchies was far less effective at controlling people's behavior than self-discipline. And what better way to encourage self-discipline than to create a political system where every individual allegedly shoulders the burdens of societal management? If the history that he is ignorant to is any indication, a Catholic monarchy would achieve the opposite effect on personal liberty that Mr. Fuentes seeks. Now, I'm still not clear on what the fuss is over tradition. Traditions are just cultural norms and practices passed down through the generations. This definition's not contentious. Trouble is that there are thousands of cultures, potentially hundreds of thousands of subcultures, and God knows how many cultures unique to friend groups or families with customs and norms that qualify as traditions. So I must ask, which traditions? Since you're Catholic, I'm going to infer you mean Catholic traditions, but still, which ones? Are we keeping the tradition of not being allowed to work on the day of the week the 28th of December falls under? What about being required to eat fish? Excommunicating people from the church who use alum from Turkey? What about the tradition of issuing licenses to allow prostitutes to do their trade as started by Pope Sixtus IV? Selling indulgences, aka exemptions to canon law? I am not making any of these up. These were all done by the Catholic Church in the past. There's more, but I think you get the idea. We can pick and choose which traditions we want to observe. Maybe some traditions just plain suck. Maybe some are wonderful. Maybe two different people can have different preferences for religions. But isn't that beautiful? That everyone can get what they want? Who should get to decide what traditions all people are required to observe? How can they be trusted to choose if they can't be trusted to choose for themselves? It is impossible. But more importantly, it is impossible to coherently define what traditions or social order that one seeks to preserve, as culture is a spontaneous phenomenon that emerges as a result of human action and influenced by external factors such as geography, politics, and economics. To constrain people to a set of traditions the rulers arbitrarily deemed to be good ignores all the context that brought about the desirability of that tradition in the first place, guaranteeing wasted effort and resources in carrying them out, while denying society the possibility of experimentation to discover better customs organically. Or, in Mr. Fuentes' words, these traditions will not be authentic. With this in mind, Let's talk Mr. Fuentes' first principle, from which everything else is derived. What he wants is order. On this, we agree. It's not my first principle, mind you, but we both want an orderly society. I just so happen to approach it from the angle of methodological individualism. Order is a spontaneous property of people freely associating and finding peaceful coexistence to be in their mutual self-interest. The structuralist perspective Mr. Fuentes peddles argues that order must be imposed from the top down. The trouble is that the order Mr. Fuentes is offering is not order, it's chaos. Every level of this ideal society has a person in charge of it. A flawed, fallible individual that, according to Mr. Fuentes' own belief system, cannot be trusted to make choices for themselves. We know they cannot make choices for themselves because they're irrational, they're self-interested, greedy, corrupt, insert negative adjective here. Yet somehow, we're expected to believe this changes the moment we give them the title of king or priest? No! What will end up happening is that these same self-interested, greedy, corrupt, irrational people will be given an exclusive monopoly on interpreting the will of the nation, a monopoly on interpreting the will of God, a monopoly on the idolatry and mythology of the nation, a monopoly on deciding what traditions ought to be observed, and a monopoly on deciding which of the other self-interested, greedy, corrupt, irrational people they get to declare as being selfless, altruistic, pure, and rational. Every aspect of this utopia is subject to the fickle, arbitrary whims of these self-interested, greedy, corrupt, irrational people with no methodology for cross-examining their source of special knowledge so as to hold them accountable to the very myths Mr. Fuentes seeks to guide society with. This double standard undermines the very foundation of this society, which is itself also subject to the transient whims of these people, who are, in turn, subject to demagoguery, propaganda, persuasion, bribery, blackmail, seduction, extortion, or compulsion. Order requires law, and laws are objective and universal. Harmony in the universe is maintained through the laws of physics, for example. The arbitrary dictates of what passes for law, both in state legislators today and in Mr. Fuentes' hypothetical utopia, is a mockery of law and order. It's arbitrary, it's fickle, it's random. And it's not enough to call it chaos, because chaos merely describes the absence of order. It's been said that hell is a place where there is no reason. And I'm not unconvinced Mr. Fuentes is trying to bring us to that dark place. But on the plus side, we got nothing to worry about. Society is rapidly and inexorably transitioning to a new social paradigm where the economic returns of violence make politics unprofitable. Even if they do get their way somehow and achieve a monarchical theocracy, it will still have the opposite effect socially that Mr. Fuentes hopes for. At every level, his nostalgia for compulsion is doomed to fail. So, nothing for us to do but sit back and enjoy the last vestiges of unironic statism while it lasts. These are frightening times, but be happy. We'll get through this, and in a decade or two, our hatchlings will be asking us about what life was like living under a state. So, some final thoughts. Is Mr. Fuentes a government shill? Does he honestly believe what he says? I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, so I'll assume he does. Mr. Fuentes clearly has a lot of the pieces. He understands the US government is under the influence of foreign governments and central banks. I assume he knows about petrodollar recycling, and if not, that he wouldn't find it controversial if it were explained to him. He understands how the government actually works. There are just a few blind spots, namely that he assumes voting matters. I haven't addressed immigration because, quite frankly, I think that issue has been discussed to death. Maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, but I'd like to think that if we did talk, we would reach some kind of understanding. However, the whole libertarian should be put in jail thing would need to be retracted. I plan on living forever, and life is too short for people who would put my life in danger. At least, we know why he wants to use government violence on libertarians. He thinks whether or not we will have a free society is up for a vote, and we'd vote against him. Well, that, and he knows, he can't debate a principled libertarian. Oh, and if anyone's wondering what kind of libertarian Nick Fuentes was, I think he was a Libertarian Party supporter, aka an unprincipled libertarian. Questions? Comments? Critique? What do you think of Nick Fuentes? Did I cover everything I needed to? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.